We are in chapter 26, Perek Chavav, on page 114 in the English, Daf Lamed Gimel in the Hebrew, 4 lines from the bottom. But before we begin, let's review a moment what we learned until now. The importance of serving God with joy and avoiding all forms of sadness, which the Rebbe introduced at the beginning of the chapter, makes it necessary for a Jew to constantly be prepared to ward off any form of sadness or anxiety or worry, and in order to be armed against this kind of undesirable disposition, the Rebbe says that we have to find solutions to cleanse the heart of all forms of sadness. And basically the sadness comes from two sources, either worldly things or spiritual things. We're either saddened by the absence or the lack of worldly blessing and success, or we are saddened by the failures in our spiritual and godly life. Now, beginning with the physical, the Rebbe says that the solution to freeing the heart of any sadness concerning physical pain or physical problems is by following the advice of the sages to be grateful for the bad as we are for the good. And why is this? Because Gamzu l'teva, because even that which appears to be bad is really for the good. And not just an ordinary good, but an unusual and higher good, to the point where it is so much higher than the average and common good that we don't even recognize it as good. We see it as being painful. Now, this doesn't mean that we are to welcome or certainly not request that kind of blessing and that kind of goodness which to us feels painful and bad and negative. Rather, when it does happen, this is how we're supposed to respond to it. In fact, in our prayers, we ask of God that He give us the kind of blessings that we can appreciate and that we do understand, and that is on our level, what to us in our world and in our limited understanding is called good. As the story was with Chene Hamagel, where they prayed for rain, and there was a lot of rain, and Chene Hamagel said to God, we can't take that much goodness. We need a smaller amount of goodness. So we ask that God give us blessings on our level, on a level that we can understand and appreciate. This doesn't mean that we don't want the greater blessing. What we're asking is that God should give us the greater blessing on such a level that we can understand it the way we understand the lesser blessing. In other words, that the greater blessing should come down and be revealed even on our plane, on our level. But should that prayer not be answered, and we receive a blessing from the higher world, from the concealed world, the way that we're supposed to react to it is recognize that since it is coming from God, and everything is in the hands of God except Yirah Shamayim, except the fear of God, so this is happening by God's plan and by God's purpose, and therefore it must be for the good. And so instead of being saddened by the pain of it, we are gladdened by the closeness of it and by the greater good of it, and in that way accept the pain gracefully. There is, of course, a higher level, and that is to not even notice that it is painful. Like the famous story with Reb Zusha, where he was asked how he can accept painful things and bad things as gracefully as we accept good things, and his response was that he wouldn't know how to explain that because nothing bad had ever happened to him, so he was never given an opportunity to experience that, even though we know that his life was a very difficult one. But he never saw the difficulty and never felt the pain in the first place, which is an even higher level. But here we're talking about the average person and how the average person should respond to his average problems. So that's the approach that the Rebbe suggests for getting rid of sadness concerning worldly things. Now, although a person can also get rid of the sadness by asking God to fulfill those gaps in his physical life and to give him the fullest measure of blessings in children, wealth, and health, but that wouldn't be the true solution, because no matter how much we have, we could always feel bad that we don't have more. So the real solution for physical happiness is to be content with what we have and to be graceful in our acceptance of the bad as we are with the good. Now, on page 114, 4 lines from the bottom, we're going to talk about the sadness that comes not from worldly concerns, but from heavenly concerns. But sadness that comes from heavenly concerns, in other words, from the anxiety that he feels over the sins that he had committed, has to find a way, a solution, and some response within himself, lipoter mimeno, to free himself of this sadness. Although a person might think that sadness concerning heavenly things is not something to be rid of, but rather something to invite. Sadness about worldly things we recognize as a negative thing because it shows that we're not recognizing that God makes this happen and that no evil comes from heaven and that this too must be for the good. But spiritual concerns, if a person is saddened over his sins, over heavenly failings, why should that be a problem? He should feel bad. And there are those who actually believe that this is the way a person should be, that a person should always be sad about his sins. And here the Rebbe says that also sins, that sadness that comes from concern over heavenly failings, over one's sins, we need to find solutions to free ourselves of that sadness. It is not acceptable and it is not tolerable. And we need to find solutions because this is not as simple as saying this too is for the good. It isn't for the good because our sins are the result of our own freedom of choice and our poor choice, bad choice. And therefore, we can't say, as we said with the physical problems, we can't say that this too is for the good and you have nothing to be sad about. It's a little more complicated than that. It isn't for the good. It is definitely not good. And it's not something that comes from heaven. It's something that we have to be sad about because we did it ourselves. We have to take responsibility. And yet, the sadness cannot be tolerated at all times. But as he says later, the sadness has to have its proper time. But here the Rebbe says that we have to get rid of this sadness too. Why do we have to get rid of it? Why not live with it, since it is the consequence of our sin? So he says as follows: Ein tzarich loimar, goes without saying that we need to find a way to get rid of the sadness, b'shas avodah, while we're serving God, doing a mitzvah, studying Torah, or anything heavenly. We have to then be free of the sadness, shetzorich lavid Hashem b'simcha v'tuv levav, because we're supposed to serve God, we're supposed to do the mitzvahs and study the Torah with simcha and with a glad heart, with enthusiasm. And the sadness doesn't permit the gladness and the enthusiasm. So it goes without saying that during the time that a person is involved in a mitzvah, it's not acceptable that he be burdened by the sadness, even sadness over sins. But even the person whose life is not Torah and mitzvahs, because he has to go out and make a living, and he works at worldly affairs, so during that time that he's involved in worldly affairs, if during the work he suddenly feels a sadness and an anxiety and a concern over heavenly things, here we would think that he should welcome it and accept it and live with it, since it's not interrupting his study. It's not dampening his enthusiasm for mitzvahs. It's during worldly, personal affairs. So we might think that he should feel bad and he should be saddened. So the Rebbe says that even then it's not acceptable, and he should find ways of ridding himself of the sadness, because biyadua, he should know shehu tachbules hayetzer, that this is a trick of the Yetzer Hara. The sadness is not coming from a godly place, it's coming from the Yetzer Hara. Now, why would the Yetzer Hara want to make a person sad over his sins? Why would the Yetzer Hara introduce a feeling of guilt? In order to be able to drag the person down into indulging in his appetites and in his passions, as is known. As is known, that sadness leads to indulgence. And the simple explanation is that since a person is constantly looking for fulfillment and for satisfaction, when the Yetzer Hara comes along and makes you feel guilty about your spiritual failings, your Yiddishkeit failings, what he means to say, what the Yetzer Hara makes you feel, is that in Yiddishkeit you're not going to get any satisfaction, because in Yiddishkeit you're a failure, and therefore you are more inclined to go looking for satisfaction and for fulfillment in other areas which are not necessarily kosher. So it does serve the purpose of the Yetzer Hara to make the person sad over his sins, because then he could more easily drag the person down into indulging. Therefore, knowing that this is a trick of the Yetzer Hara, it is clear that we need to free ourselves of this sadness, since it isn't coming from a godly place, but coming rather from the Yetzer Hara. Now, how do we know that it's coming from the Yetzer Hara? It's possible that it's coming from the Yetzer Hara. It makes sense that it would be coming from the Yetzer Hara, but how do we know for sure that it is? She'im leikein, because if this is not the case, if it's not the Yetzer Hara that's making him sad, me'ayin bo'olei atzvus amitis, where would he have, from where would a true sadness come during his work and during his involvement in worldly affairs? The sadness, true sadness over sins, would come from either a love of God or a fear of God. But where does he have love and fear of God? In the middle of his work, in the middle of his worldly affairs. Which means that if a person is to feel genuinely saddened by his sins, if the guilt that he feels is a genuine and constructive guilt, it would be coming from the love of God or fear of God that a person feels, and in light of that love or fear of God, the sin feels inappropriate and painfully wrong and out of place. And so the person feels regret and remorse and wishes the sin to be removed and erased. But if he is not conscious of his love of God or fear of God, if it is not God that is on his mind, because he's involved in his work and in worldly affairs, what kind of sadness and what kind of guilt is this that is disassociated, that is not connected with the commander who commanded the behavior or the prohibition which you violated, which you're now feeling sad about? So we have there a very important and central principle in the whole experience of guilt and chuva. And that is that in order to feel guilt, you have to know who you're guilty towards. You can't have guilt in the abstract. So if the act, if the misdeed is not inappropriate in view of a certain relationship or in the context of a relationship, then what is the misdeed and why regret it? So if the person feels a love for God or a fear of the relationship with God, where he doesn't want to ruin or lose his relationship, then the misdeed is truly inappropriate and painful in that it damages or interferes with the relationship. But when the person is not conscious of a relationship and yet is disgusted or upset over the sins that he committed, what is it that is upsetting him? So it must be coming from the Yetzer Hara. Because this kind of guilt, taken out of the context of the relationship, is unhealthy guilt, and unhealthy guilt only leads to further sinning. It doesn't make you a better person. And that's why on Yom Kippur, for example, when people sit and go over the year in order to do chuva and ask for forgiveness for whatever misdeeds they may have committed during the year, the time that we spend in shul and in contemplation is not focused on sins of the past year. We don't sit there on the holiest day of the year in the holiest place as a congregation of angels dressed in white, not eating and not sleeping and so on, and spend 24 hours dwelling on unholy thoughts or on sins that we committed in the past. And hope in this way to become cleansed and higher and pure and edel. This is certainly not the way. When we consider our relationship with God, our love of God, or our fear of God, and in this relationship, and in this desire for the relationship, we recognize that we've damaged and hurt and blemished the relationship by being careless and thoughtless and spiteful and so on, in the various ways in which we were during the year, then the sin, without having to dwell on the sin, then the thought of having sinned against God is painful and regrettable, and we feel that regret and we do tshuva. But outside the context of a relationship, when we don't know exactly who it is we feel guilty to, then this guilt is unhealthy and coming not from a godly place but from an unholy place. But this argument that the Rebbe gives, proof that this sadness is not coming from a holy place, because spontaneous regret and spontaneous sadness must be coming from the Yetzer Hara, seems to contradict a statement in a Maimon from Tafshin Ches, from the Frierdiker Rebbe, where he says that there are times when a sadness suddenly occurs to a person, and this is coming from the godly soul that feels the pain of one's lack of godliness and distance from godliness, and that this is spontaneous tshuva that can lift a person out of the undesirable place that he may find himself in and move him, transport him to a more godly place. So how do we know that this sadness is an undesirable one? Maybe it is a spontaneous tshuva that is very desirable and a gift from above. Or as it says, that there's a basko. Every day there's a heavenly voice that calls out and asks Jews to do tshuva. And the Rebbe asks, what is the point of this basko, of this heavenly voice, since nobody can hear the voice? Of what value, of what purpose is it? And the explanation is that the neshama is partly limited and contained within the body or by the body, but there's also a part of the neshama that is not limited by the body. That part of the neshama that is higher than the conscious mind or higher than the body does hear that heavenly voice, and it moves the neshama deeply, and from the feelings, from the inspiration that the higher part of the neshama gets from this baskel, that inspiration filters down into the part of the neshama that is within the body, and here the body interprets that feeling of discomfort, that unrest because of a spiritual dissatisfaction. The body interprets it in its own way, and it becomes a sadness, an unexplained sadness. But that really is coming from the godly soul, and from the godly soul's disquiet over spiritual flaws and spiritual failings. So how do we tell them apart? How do we know when it's a sadness coming from the animal soul, from the Yetzer Hara, and when is it a spontaneous chuva? So generally, the difference between the chuva and the sadness is that the sadness focuses on the past. He is sad or saddened and remorseful over the sins of the past. The spontaneous chuva that occurs is primarily focused on the future. He wants to become better from now on. He wants the future to be better. So, when a person is feeling a spontaneous chuva, a dissatisfaction with the way things are, and he wants to become better, that doesn't bring on a sadness, because you don't regret the future. Concerning the future, do what you have to do. But in regretting the past, in focusing on the past, here we have a sadness, a feeling of remorse, of regret, of guilt. Now, if the sadness is spontaneous, then we know that it's coming from the Yetzer Hara. Because for the true remorse and true regret and true tshuva, for this you need an awareness and a focusing on godliness and on holiness and on the sadness of being separated from God and the loss of godliness and so on, and this doesn't come spontaneously. So we've established that the sadness over heavenly concerns, the regret over past sins, is also something that we need to free ourselves of and to get rid of, either because it's occurring during the davening and during learning, and then it is certainly not acceptable because we're supposed to be doing this with joy. But even if the sadness is occurring during worldly activities, we have to get rid of it then too, because it is coming from an unholy place and will lead to further unholiness. Now, whether the sadness occurs during davening and learning, or if it happens not during the time of serving God, but during worldly activities, either way, the solution is that Zeis Yosim El Libe, this is what he is to take to heart, Ki Ein Hazman Gromo Ko'eis La'atzvus Amitis, that this is not the right time, this is not the right moment for true sadness. Not even for concern or anxiety over serious sins, God forbid. Which means that it's true that there should be sadness over the sin. It is a cause for sadness. But the person has to tell himself that the true sadness, which is legitimate and necessary, has to have a certain set time, and this, in the middle of the day, spontaneous sadness, this is not the time for this tshuva. But in order to have true sadness, appropriate sadness, for this we need set times, predetermined times, and auspicious times, conducive time. B'yishuv hadas, with presence of mind. Lehizbein and b'gdulas Hashem, he needs the time to sit down and dwell on God's greatness. Asher chotoloi, to recognize the greatness of God before whom he has sinned. Kedei shal yedei ze yihye libei nishbar be'emes, so that through this the heart will be truly broken, because he is thinking about the greatness of God. And in light of God's greatness, the sin becomes truly unacceptable. And then the heart becomes truly broken, b'meriris amitis, with a true bitterness, not a passing regret, but a true bitterness. And when is this appropriate time? What are these set times? This is explained elsewhere. And it's explained elsewhere that these times are either at night during the Shema before going to bed, or during Tikkun Chatzos for those who say Tikkun Chatzos. Shom is by Gamkein, and there, in the same place where it talks about the appropriate times for this chuva, it also explains Kiniyad Achashenish Libe, that immediately after the broken-heartedness, the Itin Kvuyim Haim, during those predetermined times, Azai Yosir Ha'etzev Melibe Legamri. Immediately after the experience of the sadness and the broken-heartedness during those predetermined times, he immediately has to remove the sadness from the heart completely. V'yamin emunah shleima, and believe with a total faith, ki Hashem hevir chatosei, that God has removed his sin, v'rav l'sleiach, and God's forgiveness is abundant, unlike human forgiveness. Once we've forgiven a certain act, and the person repeats that act again, we find it more difficult to forgive a second time, and certainly a third time, a fourth time, and so on. And here we're coming to God and we're asking for forgiveness, and we have to trust and believe that he does forgive. How do we know that he forgives? Isn't it asking a lot? Isn't it possible that because we've asked for forgiveness and repeated the sin, God is not forgiving us? Or maybe we haven't done an appropriate chuva and our regret wasn't sincere, and so on. Yet, we are told to believe with a total faith that God has forgiven and removed the sin, because God's forgiveness is not like a human's forgiveness, and his forgiveness is abundant. And this is another important ingredient in getting rid of the sadness and in not falling into the trap of the Yetzer Hara, because here the Yetzer Hara can come along and say, fine, you've done your tshuva, but how do you know that it was sufficient? How do you know it was sincere? And how do you know God forgives you? This too could be part of the Yetzer Hara's tricks to make the person feel that when it comes to Yiddishkeit, he's a failure. And the purpose would be to then lead the person into finding fulfillment in areas outside of Yiddishkeit. So when the person says, I'm still feeling bad because I don't think God forgives me, that too is a trick of the Yetzer Hara. And this is the true joy that comes after the sadness, as mentioned before, that the virtue of sadness is that it produces a greater joy after the sadness is removed. And we said then, earlier in the chapter, that this applies to true sadness. That true sadness has a benefit, and that is that it brings to a true joy. The true sadness is when he sets aside appropriate times to contemplate God's greatness, and in light of that awareness the sin feels very inappropriate. That's true sadness, true brokenheartedness. And then he asks God for forgiveness because he knows whom to ask for forgiveness. He knows against whom he has sinned and towards whom he is feeling regret. And then he knows that God forgives him. And this forgiveness brings an increased and deepened joy, which is the benefit that is to be derived from true sadness.